Good morning, everyone. We are here today to talk about a topic we almost never hear about. We're going to talk about mass transportation today. So this gets into an interesting space. You would think we're only talking about urban planning, but in fact there's a significant amount of information in the environmental space, also looking at education and how we can improve the design and planning for these kinds of structures and really infrastructure. So my dad's going to come on today, and we're going to go ahead and add him in. And here he comes. And so we're really going to talk about how do we think about this design. Hey, Dad.
Good morning.
Good morning. So I was just doing the quick intro on mass transportation. I know we've gone back and forth, but I feel like this is a really interesting discussion point and something that frankly never ever makes the stage. Nobody asks about this,
Well, it's an
but it's very
interesting.
important.
Well, it is important. Unfortunately, I did a little research on it, and I wanted to find out, a little more about what's going on with the
Or what's
mass
not.
transit. Yeah, well, and there's some good reasons. I mean, one of the things that
Yeah.
that I found out and everything is that since 1920, ridership has not increased, even though our population has significantly increased and its cost. Um, uh, that's one of the major reasons why we don't have a lot of mass transportation around here is because a gentleman by the name of Henry Ford convinced
So
everybody that,
I'll be going to the Henry Ford Innovation in 2 days, I think, and in fact we'll be doing an interview with them. So I would just do
he,
a plug for that.
all right, well, he was instrumental in making sure that everybody had individual transportation rather than mass transportation.
Yes.
And that really started to take over in the 1920s, and therefore as the nation expanded, it didn't need mass transportation to capitalize on our country's growth and whatever. And so mass transportation really centered more or less around the Northeast, and more centralized is in the cities with the subways in New York and Washington and Philadelphia and Boston and several, Chicago having its L system and that type of thing. It was important to their growth, but they were also private. And what happened was is that as that private individual transportation segment grew at enormous rates, those private companies really started going out of business. They were being crushed by the loss of revenue, by the cost of operations. They had to figure out what was going on. And so the government, local or state or not very much federal, started to subsidize what was going on. And so therefore today we kind of see just a skeleton of what was, really going on at that time. And the ones that do have mass transit that's working is heavily subsidized by the communities. Um, and so growth of it today is going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult for a lot of reasons. We still love that individual transportation. It's a love affair that I don't think America is very willing to give up, whether you're youthful or you're not. I think they still love, being able to, in 2 seconds, run out, jump, turn a key, and go wherever they want on a personal basis without having, any conflict. And so, in order to spur interest in it, I think it's going to be still a long term away simply because the cost is extraordinary. I mean, it's like any other of the major topics we've discussed. There's an extraordinary price tag put on it. Number two, I think uh, the interest until we're really confronted with something is going to be very, very low still. And so it's a difficult subject. It has certainly its value. I think all the reasons everyone can figure out logically why it's better for the environment, better for, all kinds of things. There's less, we don't need to build more roads. We need to build more, mass transit systems. But we're not going to do that simply because of the, taxation. People either have to want it or it's probably not going to happen. Your thoughts?
May I push back just a little?
Sure, sure.
So I think what happens here is largely what happens across all the issues we try to tackle, is that we're
Right.
looking at one piece of it. And the one piece of it, if all we're going to do is build a rail system of some sort, take your variety,
Sure.
speed, etc., then yes, I think you're exactly right. It's not going to work. But think about my kids, for example, right? Mitch and Monica are 20 and 18 and have never had a driver's license, either one
Right.
of them.
Right.
And I don't know that they're ever going to get one. Mitchell lives in New York City. Monica's going to be in New York as well. And, you know, they can Uber wherever they need to go. So that individual piece, when needed, is available. The cost for us to get them insurance is extremely high for the very, I mean, if they were going to use it all the time, fine. But, I mean, Mitchell's home, I can count the number of weeks he's home a year. So it's not worth it to pay for all of that when he's going to live in a city where it's not needed. So I think what you're going to see is, or what we need to see is a designed system. And that means what we call it human-centered design. And this is actually what I did in the government. Because what happens is we create a solution, but we don't think about the humans using it. So we build a railway system and say, look, it goes from, in our town, right, I-4 corridor, Sanford to Orlando. And we say, wow, we built it, people will come. No, they won't. They don't want to stick to a schedule. They don't want to have to, they still have to drive to the terminal. They still have to take it downtown. It doesn't save them time. It doesn't save them money. So nobody thought about it from the user perspective, right? Instead, what we have to do is pick representative people and say, what is it that would make it easier for them to rely mostly on mass transit? And then how do we bridge the gap in other places so that it is still less expensive, but doable, convenient, and reasonable for those different representative individuals? So Mitch is a great example, right? Even though as a high schooler, you get excited about being able to get a driver's license. In his case, he was on a campus already, so he didn't need one. Then he goes to New York City and you think, well, all he needs to do is take the subway 90% of the time. The other 10%, it would cost $500 to $1,000 a month for a parking spot, plus insurance, plus the car. Now it's a no-brainer. You need to get somewhere, Uber, or
Right.
Lyft, or whatever the rideshare option is.
Sure.
So now you start thinking about this across the country, right? And you start thinking about what is the combination of transportation choices that could make a difference. So maybe you don't get everybody to give up all their cars, but maybe you move from having 3 cars in a family to 1 car, right? So that it's still available if it's needed, but at least 1 or 2 family members are able to use mass transit. The goal, while the goal may be stated to eradicate individual travel, I think that's obviously unlikely. But most of the environmentalists that I talked to all said, if we could even reduce the harm that's being caused, we would have an enormous win. So I think, Dad, the goal isn't, or at least not immediately, to your point of time, let's just build these mass railway or bus systems that immediately will be used. Rather, let's think about how each different user community might operate and make it easier and cheaper for them to at least a portion of their time use the mass transit. And when that happens, when it's more expensive to park than it is to take the train, you start taking the train at least some of the time.
Yeah. I'm going to go back on one of your points, and I think we talk about uh, the the cost, but as far as studies show, it's more about the time. Really, time is really the most
Depends on how
valuable
much the
piece.
cost is. There's always a tipping point.
Well, cost, there
right?
is a tipping
I mean,
point, but the cost, but the time, people, well, they increase whatever they need to eventually in wages, whatever, to cover cost. It's about the time. They've done studies and they show that if you can take the amount of time which it takes to get to wherever they're going to use the transportation and cut it down to at least 15 minutes. If it goes over 15 minutes, it's just about at a tipping point. If it goes up to 30, which is in most cities, and that's when it's definitely not working, because they can't. People have too much going on in their lives and everything like that, and so 30 minutes to take you someplace where you're still not at your destination is just not effective. It's just not going to work, and so we have to figure that piece out, what you're just stating, and that's really about what you just said. Is what's the rider need? Where do they go? How do they fix it? How do we get them there? And how do we make it as easy as possible for that to happen? So
And
to your
to be clear, the term cost includes
yes,
time, right?
okay, yes,
Resources are going to
yeah,
be, does it cost me mentally? Does it
right,
cost me physically? Does it cost me time? Does it cost me money? All of these are considered costs. And
right,
when we assess things for government or military or other programs, a good assessment will cover all of those pieces and refer to resources more generally versus simply the financial burden, because that is one piece, but you're right, it's not the only piece. I mean, for example, if it's the case that it takes me an hour to drive somewhere, or I could spend 10 minutes driving to a train and spend 30 minutes on the train, but during that 30 minutes I can work, and I have a flexible
yes,
enough job that rewards me for that 30-minute time frame, because we've changed the structure and expectation of
right,
face-to-face work. Well, now my 2 hours a day of commuting has reduced to two 40-minute segments, but an entire hour of it was still considered work. So I go from 2 hours to 20 minutes, and now I've saved time.
right, and
Yeah.
and and that is going to be the focus that's going to have to happen, is figuring out how to minimize that, um, or it's not minimize, actually make the transportation um, productive,
Mm-hmm.
like you stated. It has to be productive in time. I think one of the things that you're seeing, and the movement being, how that's going to work somewhat, is the self-driving car. I think people are realizing that if they don't have, if they have a self-driving car, they can actually be productive in the space that they're working, driving, because so many times they're in this quagmire of automobiles that are trying to go to nowhere, and they're unproductive. I mean, they're sitting there, but more and more people are listening to podcasts in their car while they're
Right.
sitting in traffic. The cell phone has allowed them to communicate during their trip and everything like that. Now, if it's a self-driving car, they can actually do some production with it in that environment. However, again, that goes back to the other part of the ecosystem that we need to focus in on, and why using mass transportation is important, because we don't want to continue to pollute the air and have to uh, extract resources out of the ground, which has all kinds of different other environmental processes going on and everything like that. So um, it's a it seems like a small problem. We should just throw a bunch of money at it and have it go, and it's not. Again, we're looking at a situation where there's so much below the water in the iceberg than there is on the top and where you see it. And um, I think it's a tool for the future, but it still has to have a buy-in. There still has to be a mental buy-in by a lot of people. Now, Mitch and Monica, I understand where they're at and where they live, and I know my cousin Molly, who lives up there in New York and stuff like that, relies heavily on living in that area without a driver's license. She has one now, but she hadn't had one for years. I mean, it
Right.
just until they moved a little further out into Queens. But you get out west, and they don't even know what you're talking about. They just
Well,
uh,
no, their stuff is not. You have to start with the goal that things are centrally located,
right, right,
right? I mean, it's not going to be the case that you're going to have an individual mass transit program. I mean, that's not going to be
no,
effective or likely to occur. So we're really talking about those spaces where we have a concentration and location of. I get off the train and within 10 minutes I can walk wherever I need to. Well, if that stop is 10 minutes to a lot of businesses and a lot of programs or companies, then fine. But yeah, if it's out west, you're probably not, or not entirely. California's well populated, but Montana's probably not going to get one soon.
no. The
Now,
need. The
I
need is pretty
will,
small too.
yeah, I will give one caveat to this. So something that I've been kicking around for a while, and this has to do with taxes and rethinking the way that we collect taxes.
Right.
And one of the things that they do overseas is they tax individuals who come to their country. We don't really do this. We pay federal taxes based on our income rather than based on our consumption or our activities. And when we do that, because it's based on our income, those that come to visit our nation, whether that be for a short period of time or a long period of time, essentially don't help pay for the infrastructure in our country. And so I've thought a lot about how do we do a better job branding our country as a place to visit. So they've done some of this actually in Iceland. Unfortunately, they're a very small country, so their infrastructure was
Yes.
not quite set up for what they did. But conceptually, you can follow. They had this huge increase in dollars and revenue coming into the country. They failed to anticipate how much of an impact it was going to be. But we have a much larger country, so some of the issues that they experienced are not quite not quite as easily or directly translated to us. So my
Right.
point. If we think about how do we increase our revenue without further taxing Americans, we start thinking outside our borders. Then you think about how do you get people in, and then you think about what kind of experience are you providing to them. And then I started thinking about our rural areas and thinking, how do we get more revenue into those rural areas without increasing their infrastructure? They live in a small town for a reason, and we want to protect that kind of environment, but at the same time we need more revenue coming in some cases. So mass transit, when tied to a visitor's experience, may very well help fund the development, may very well create, maybe not mass transit within a small town, but from a small town to another small town to a larger city across the nation. And what you would see in that kind of an infrastructure plan is that you would get money moving in without people staying and disrupting the small town atmosphere. They would really be transient through. And you would create opportunities for folks to take jobs outside of their town and be able to come home either on a nightly or weekly basis without incurring as much of the burden of the cost of the development of the infrastructure. So I started looking into this a little bit, and I kept thinking we need to brand America. And then lo and behold, I found that we actually have a government program called brandamerica.gov. And I thought,
Oh, go
are you
figure.
kidding? I know. I
It's
was
well
like,
known, obviously, right?
obviously well known, yes. And I thought, okay, I have been researching these government programs for years. And literally, this is in my official duties. So I am clearly being paid to find all of these, and they're still this difficult to find. And it wasn't until I started kind of creating some materials based on this concept that I realized we have a lot of this already going. So my idea has clearly been thought of before, which is not shocking. What's exciting is there is a maturity to this program and that we probably could do a better job elevating it and expanding it and
Great.
using it. Tying it to housing and urban development, tying it to Department of Transportation, tying it to the EPA, tying it to how it is that we in the in Interior and Treasury and all the other departments, there is a lot here. And this is one of those programs that I think we could lift up and use much more effectively than it's being used right now. Because, yeah, I would be shocked if anybody listening has ever heard of it.
Yeah, and I'm going to stretch a little further from what you're talking about, especially after listening to the last couple guests that you had on and that
Weren't
you
they
interviewed.
great?
They were.
They were
I was.
tremendous.
I mean, and I'm sitting down and I'm starting to think. One of the things that stresses our society out is transportation, and if we can reduce
Yes.
the stress and introduce um, stress relief even in the transportation side of it, as it, where people could mingle,
Yeah.
communicate, use it
Yeah.
as a forum for education. While you're going from point A to point B, you could be studying and becoming educated during that time, and the transportation would just be a non, it doesn't interfere with anything. You could do so many different things, but you know, the two guests was quite profound as far as I was concerned in listening to both of those two people. How we've really increased the stress in our lives through the demands and our growth and everything. And I'm not going to minimize the greatness that it created. However, we've continued to stress ourselves out because of it, and I don't know if it's paid off in dividends for other reasons, which is showing up in the different increases in anger and whatever throughout our society. So. But if we could use mass transportation to create some other environments that would produce, greater results in calming us and taking advantage of those things, I think that would even be a great idea going along with that. And I think it should be folded into the thoughts and
Yeah.
how that's going. So
That's a
just
great design element. I hadn't thought of that at all, but I love it. We just need
yeah,
to go on Shark Tank.
yeah. We'll just think of
We don't want to
something
ask
that
the government to to fund it, so we'll come
well,
and bring the innovation in. But no, your point is spot on, which is how do you make this productive time? And productive might be that it reduces the number of hours I spend at the office. Productive
yeah,
might be that this is the time that I meditate and spend time with myself, being calm before I get into the office. It
right,
might be the time. In fact, how timely with Mr. Rogers, the movie is just coming out. One of the psychological intentional actions that Mr. Rogers did in his show, we used to study this in grad school.
right,
You would always see him. He would come back from whatever his adventure was from the day. And what did he do? He changed his clothes.
right,
Why did he do it? And you watch, the children would sit mesmerized watching him change into his cardigan, change his
right,
shoes. Very intentional maneuver, because what it was saying is, I'm going from the chaos of outside to the calm of the interior of the home. Same thing could be achieved through a mass transit perspective. I will say, in traveling through DC, there's nothing more exhausting than, than trying to drive back home from that. That is
sure,
like my nerves were just
right,
so intense, because it might be on paper a 45-minute drive. By the time I ended, it would run anywhere from an hour and a half to 4 hours, and you couldn't predict. That was part of the frustration, is you didn't even
sure,
know. So the mass transit was beneficial in that case, if for no other reason that you knew exactly how long you were going to be there. But I think, yeah, I mean, I think if you could create a user experience that was decidedly thanks, Meredith. That is decidedly beneficial to the person and or the individuals using it. I think you would see a lot of change. So, I think that's it. And what you're pulling on, Dad, is how all of these things connect. More and more and more as we talk about this, it isn't about just the mass. It's not just about the Department of Transportation coming up with a new idea.
no,
It's about talking to the folks from the environmental groups and saying, what do we need to do to make sure we plan forward and hit those wickets? Hi, Mary. And then it's talking to the innovators and saying, how do we think outside the box to make sure that we're connecting? And then it's talking to the human-centered designers and the housing and urban development folks and saying, how do we not only take care of this for our developing groups and think forward, but how do we maybe maneuver this to be beneficial to each individual and maybe even influx revenue dollars from outside our nation? It always boggles my mind that we want to make more money by recirculating it.
right,
Like, that's not the way to make more money.
no,
We make more money by bringing it in from somewhere else and reducing our cost. And so I think this is one of those places where we need to be talking about that. I've been talking to someone online through my LinkedIn page, and so he wrote me back and said, "Well, these are the areas I'm an expert in, and it crosses basically everything." And I said, "That's exactly it. We need people who are the experts in a deep dive, but we also need our broad experts, right?
right,
Because for this reason, we need to connect everything. We can't solve one problem without having an impact on another. And the goal is that that impact helps the problem, not makes it worse. And too
right.
often we make it worse. Yeah, yeah. But we got
And
to get some holistic thinkers into politics to get there.
yeah, well, and that's going to be difficult. I mean, just simply because of the way uh, we operate. But and that's not just in our world. I mean, that's across the world. I mean, in our nation, that's across the world. I mean,
That is not
politics.
entirely. We'll take issue with that. That is not entirely the case. There are plenty of nations who absolutely value the experts in key areas and put them
Oh,
into their leadership space. Many of the countries we follow do take a similar tactic of either a dictatorship or a
right.
popularity contest, but that is not true throughout the world.
Oh, I understand what you're saying from that standpoint.
Yeah.
It's the ones that are excited about that we're in conflict with because of the way they do things. But yeah, I think, and I'm sticking to mass transportation, but the fact is, I'm familiar with in Minneapolis, one of the things that really took
Yeah.
hold up there was the skyway system between buildings, where we weren't relying on even any kind of transportation, getting out and having to go from one place to the other. You could walk almost the
Yes.
entire city um, without climate problem either, because obviously there's an extreme climate issue up in Minneapolis, and you could get to your office and park. Okay, whether you came down in mass transit or you actually drove into the city, and you never had to, go back out to that vehicle for almost any reason or any service. I mean, every service was available to you, and thoroughly walk between the rest of the city, elevated above it, and comfort. You could go eat, you can go shop, you can go, get a doctor's appointment, you can do anything you want, and you never had to do anything but walk in a very comfortable space getting there.
Another great example of how you make it user friendly and a
Yeah,
benefit to have
it was.
to stay away from those cars. So, yeah, I think that's the big punchline is, one, how do we make this a user experience that
Yep.
people want to be part of, that actually gives them a benefit, not just I should be better about the way I do this. That's not going to motivate enough people to get some.
No.
And then two, how do we make sure that we connect it to all the other elements that we're trying to solve in this country? Because that's when the real change occurs.
Yeah. And
Well,
and we have to be long-term thinkers too. Because this is a
that may just
long-term.
send us right over the edge, down right now.
Okay. Well, okay.
We're trying in our country to get past the 10-minute mark.
I know.
If I have one more marketing person tell me, we like watching cats that spin in circles, and I'm like, can we think forward? Well, maybe a little. Yeah, I don't know. We're trying now. We're trying. I think proactive is definitely a good goal. Whether or not we're all ready for that complexity, I don't know.
So how's your day look today? Where are you going?
Today, we are heading into Columbus, Ohio. We will be going to the International Women's Air and Space Museum. So we're excited to do that. I have an interview with the Washington Post in about an hour. So I'm excited to go have that as well. In fact, my phone was kind of blowing up, so I don't actually know what the follow-up was. I was ignoring the texts that are coming through. But yeah, so I'm excited to meet with them. And then we'll be moving forward. I'm gathering a lot of the articles on healthcare now and really starting to pull that together so we get the strategy outward. I would encourage people to go and watch the two interviews from yesterday, Dr. Hain and Dr. Wallace. Yeah, they were really tremendous and perfectly aligned with what's happening right now, right? One was talking about massive school shootings and the precursors to it and how it is that we start to intervene much earlier. And the second, of course, was focused on how do we take a much more holistic view of mental health and recognizing that maybe I need to start using the word society health. And even recognizing we need to use those words in our government policies to recognize that cost, to come full circle in our discussion, is not just about financial cost, but it is also about time and health and environment and other pieces. So looking at that stress as an actual cost, I think may be a beneficial consideration and something that we need to actually come up with a measurement tool for.
Okay.
So yeah, definitely great things. Good. All right. Well, next week we'll get together and we'll close it out with Veterans Health, which I think is quite apropos. and go over a couple of those pieces. And then next month, very soon, Dad, we're into the military. So let's come up with, yeah. So this is an area which is definitely more my comfort zone. The next 2 months, military and education, will certainly be a space in which I'm more knowledgeable than these first two, but now I'm quite knowledgeable.
One of the things, well, and I don't want to make the conversation here longer, but I think what you've done here so far has tied the each of these issues together in a much, and hopefully we can point out that the military is not the military of people going out and boots on the ground and doing things. They're so involved in the infrastructure world of ours, and helpful in that process, and have thought of
Absolutely.
so many different things that maybe a lot of people like you pointed out even yesterday's
Yeah,
conversation, how they're looking at stress and how it impacts their people under high stress situations, and the practices that they need to formulate around that. So I think it'll be exciting. It'll be good. And so, yes, and enjoy. I hope the post interview goes well. That'll be great.
oh yeah. Oh, I'm sure it will. I always enjoy talking to reporters because they usually get on the phone and assume I'm going to sound either like a preacher,
Yes,
or B, that I'm not going to make a lot of sense. And usually about 3 minutes in, they retract that position, and then
good.
they start really talking to me. So I always enjoy talking to reporters. There, it's a new experience for me, but they're just people, so
Oh,
it's
so,
not
like
that
Becca said,
challenging.
throw one of your quotes in there, and then that'll get them all excited. Anyhow,
well, we'll see. I definitely would like to see all of what we're doing elevated, not because I'm the one that's leading it, but because the information that's coming through from all of the people that we're talking to is so profound and connected, or could be connected. It needs to be connected. And I think that's when
yeah,
we really get to the problem solving space. And that's not something we're hearing in politics right now. But when you put people on stage based on how much money they raise, I, it's not to say they aren't hard workers. I think they're tremendously hard workers. It's just,
oh
I
yeah,
mean, literally the value metric is how much money can you raise, and
sure.
so that is what it is. That's the reality of it. So, all
Change is
right,
hard.
Dad.
Take care. Be
Thanks,
safe.
Dad. You too. Bye bye.
All right. Bye bye.